So RDA has developed a FAIR data maturity matrix, and DataONE has developed a FAIR suite, I think is what they call it. And so what I've done is looked at the EDI data and the whole EDI data corpus and tried to figure out how fair our data are. So if there's somebody in the audience who was looking for more general FAIR discussion, it will be very specific to EDI and how we have implemented the different aspects of this FAIR. Maybe I should even say FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that is a buzzword that has been around for a few years now, and we'll discuss the more details as we go. And with no further ado, I think I should give Shelley the floor and introduce the RDA FAIR data maturity model.
Thank you, Corinna. And yeah, I did add a slide to the deck, so I don't have to forget the link. So hi, I work at the American Geophysical Union. I am our Senior Director for Data Leadership. I have an extensive background in data management and software development and management. And I came to AGU in order to work through challenges around our community, all the different stakeholders, and bringing awareness of the importance of data and software management. And I also have an extensive background in the capability maturity model that is been around for 30 years, started by Carnegie Mellon in an FFRDC, hosted or sponsored by the Air Force. So the capability maturity model is commonly applied to software development, and you become certified in applying it, and you become certified in how it's been applied. And it's a methodology that's been used. It's an open methodology, and it's been used to help people think about applying a framework. And that's what happened in RDA. That exact methodology was not applied directly, but the concept was applied. And what was happening is there were a number of us, FAIR came out, we all know this, maybe you don't, but it did. 2016, the FAIR guiding principles were published in Springer Nature, incredibly heavily cited document. And it generated this, the word that I really like that others have used is called an inflection point. A number of communities within research needed a way to talk about best practices so that everyone could head in the same direction on how to make data and software findable or discoverable, how to make it accessible in a way where you didn't have to ask someone for access, or you didn't have to know the secret code, that it was in a format that was usable. Interoperable is sometimes a really difficult thing to get your arms around. And then did you license it in a way that others actually have the capability of reusing your data? And EDI is, I'm very biased about EDI. They're one of my favorite repositories because you all have been thinking about this for a very long time, and you have been ahead of the work happening in FAIR. You've actually, because of what your community has needed, you have actually tried to figure out what these things are without having the acronym, and then the acronym showed up. So I really like using EDI as an example because it demonstrates the value that implementing FAIR has to a community. Now you're asking the question, how well have you implemented this particular framework? I think that's great. So let's move on. I'll tell you about this work. So I'm a co-chair of the RDA FAIR Data Maturity Model Working Group, which is now in maintenance mode. And there's a number of folks that have helped it directly, and then a very large community that has been part of the development of this model. So next slide. So what we are, so the context of how we went about building the recommendations had to do with the number of assessments that were built around those FAIR guiding principles. And then communities were adopting and adapting it to their own needs, but there was no common way to look at it. The principles themselves are not strict. There's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of room for interpretation. And we were looking for a way to be able to compare apples to apples across the existing assessment methodologies. So what would that look like? What would a core, it says here, a core assessment criteria be? And there's a lot of materials to read about this. I'm going to give those all to you. That it would take some hours for us to walk through everything. And I think Corinna has some questions. So let's just jump to the next slide. So what we tried not to do, what we were very deliberate in not doing and kept out of our scope, was we were not building an evaluation method. We were building a framework instead. And we told you what to do, not how to do it. So that's the nature, that's the way we took a framework. That's also how the capability maturity model does their framework. In order to allow for different communities to apply criteria in ways that were meaningful, it gives that flexibility. And we stuck although there are areas that are weak within the FAIR principles, depending on your different perspectives, we stuck to them so that we could keep a steady scope. And now at this point in maintenance mode, we're looking at what those gaps are. So next slide. The path took a while. So remember the FAIR data, the FAIR principles came out in 2016. They were meant to apply to data, but they're broad enough that they can apply to other digital products. And the working group established in 2019, we were very blessed. The European Commission has been putting a lot of money into implementing FAIR. If you don't know, the FAIR is FAIR project and EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, they're pretty much funding those things, and they gave us an editorial support. So the co-chairs actually leaned on folks that could actually type notes and synthesize content and have some nice thoughtful conversations, but take direction straight from the co-chairs. And this helped a very large project move very swiftly. And we were able to get the first version out of the model in early 2020 and get that published. And now we're working on adoption and getting feedback and figuring out what the next version of that model is going to look like. Next slide. By the way, we no longer have our editorial staff, which is why things have all of a sudden moved much more slowly. So this is the process. I don't know that you really care about the process too much, so I'm going to skip this slide. If we need to go back, we can talk about it more. And then the different stakeholders have different purposes and methods and objects. So we try to consider all of the different points of view in the way we went about our work. That doesn't mean everyone was happy fully, but there was a way forward, and very, very sensitive towards our approach. And also realizing that with a framework as a tool, it can be wielded in ways that are difficult for researchers as a go, no-go criteria. And we were also really cautious to watch for that rhetoric and guide away from it. This is meant to help research communities, like repositories, like researchers, make progress towards something. Getting all the way there is not necessarily the gold star. Getting partway there could be good enough. So we were really cautious on that rhetoric. So next slide. And this is where we are. What's sort of groups we're targeting for adoption. Funders are, as you can imagine, funders are interested. The European Commission was very interested. Communities, and then what do we need to do going forward? And you see the note there about fair enough. 100% is not necessarily how we like to talk about things because everyone's in a different place, but moving towards improvement, giving a path for improvement is really valuable. And then what does that mean? So next slide. These were the challenges that we had. So we can come back to this slide if you want to go on to the next one. And the additional challenges. If you were trying to apply this process to other things, what you really needed to be aware of. What was time consuming, the importance of face-to-face meetings. We did most of this work face-to-face at RDA sessions with supporting online sessions. And then when pandemic hit, I was just really grateful that we were nearly done, because the people are very passionate about this, and it's helpful to be with someone to talk through a challenge. It's harder to do that online, I think, as we all know. Being open to feedback, having an opportunity for feedback, making sure people felt heard, and then what does it mean to provide maintenance? I would say we're not really doing a really good job with that now. That's an area that we can actually improve because we lost our main support system for keeping things moving. The makeup of the co-chairs, we're all very busy, so it's been hard for us to keep that going. Although it's just not as fast. Next slide. And here, so I realize this is baked into the slides, but Corinna has them, and you're all welcome to take a look at those materials. But I do want to take a moment to talk about what we're doing within AGU, because I think this might help you realize how much we need the work that you're doing here in EDI to help other communities talk to researchers. So if you could go on to the next slide. Oh, I popped this. Okay, yeah, this is great. Okay, so our recommendation is published on the RDA website underneath the working group. And there is a companion document to walk you through how this all happened in the Data Science Journal for CODATA. And this was published in 2020, I think. As everyone, time is squishy. So I think it was 2020, may have been 2021. Don't laugh at me. It might have been the end of 2020 and I'm thinking 2021. I think it was the end. I think it was November. So this would be a really good way to introduce you to the recommendations. And then the full set of recommendations are on the RDA website. Actually, there's a Noto community where you can download those. So next slide. So there's a number of use cases we've gathered. This particular one, I think, is a nice complement to the work that Matt Jones is doing that came out of the European Commission that I would like to highlight to you that you may not be aware of. Part of FAIR is FAIR was to come up with a tool, and this one is open and available, that can apply to any repository, any data that applies the FAIR criteria. And to the credit of this group, they embraced a FAIR data maturity model as a guide for how to do that. It wasn't the only thing they did, but they did use it, and we're very grateful for that. So it helps to connect the model, the framework, with an actual tool, an assessment methodology. And so I would highly recommend you walk through it. They take every single element within the framework and show you what they did, how they applied it, and knowing that we don't necessarily have mechanisms for everything in the community yet. But I want to highlight for you something that that's very special within EDI that is not true most other places. And when we talk about vocabulary and how you align vocabulary to a data set, EDI gives the researcher a way to do that easily because of all of the work you've already done within your system. And what you'll see identified here is that is not common. And they actually chose, of all the elements within the FAIR criteria, they actually chose not to touch vocabulary because they couldn't go to vocabulary directly. It's not mature enough yet. But because EDI has figured out for your community what the best vocabulary is and the options that are available, you have answered the question and you've baked it into your system. So that's a really big deal. Okay, next slide. So in case you've not seen this is something that I tend to always lead in a talk that I give about the work at AGU, our position statement on data, which does include software as well. and how Earth, space, and environmental science data. I always added in, depending on where you are, you either see yourself in Earth and space or you do not. And if you're in the world of environmental data, you do not. So Earth, space, and environmental data are a world heritage. It's really important, well, with the work that we do in supporting researchers around the globe, that we make that data available. It's preserved, it's documented. You can read the whole thing. It's about a 2-page document, and it guides the work that we do. And so repositories, finding discipline-specific repositories is really important. Next slide. It's important but hard, and I'm going to get to that point. So we have taken a number of approaches to guide our authors and researchers on finding the best repository for their data. This is one of the hardest. I never imagined this when I joined AGU, that this would be one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it is. And I'm going to show you how I'm still not good with our solution. I want you to know that, but I want you to see how we're going about it. And maybe as you are thinking about your metadata and you're thinking about how you're working with EDI and how you're making your metadata searchable, the kinds of problems we're running into, and wouldn't it be great if other repositories could be more similar and think about it from a different point of view. So on this resources page, which is in GitHub, by the way, so you can do pull requests and make comments. We have a resource, I think it's on the next slide, that we've just recently built. We've been tinkering away on our author guidelines for data and software availability statements and citations. So that directly dovetails straight into what repository. And this one is organized by journal. It's not going to be our last one. We're going to give it another go this year on reworking this. Doing it by journal is still not the right way. But if you please take a look sometime and just look what we're struggling with and think about the entire repository community, including general, including institutional, including national repositories, because it's, we have an international author base where 50% are in Asia. We're really challenged with how to direct them to the best possible repository. I wish I could just put EDI at the top and say, go here, but that's not realistic. So it's a real problem. And I don't want you to solve it now. This is not the reason for this webinar, but as you're thinking about how to improve EDI, you're actually helping me solve this problem by working through the issues that researchers are having and how best to find data. So that it will come back to benefit me sometime. Next slide. That's it.
Thank you, Shelley. That was great. Are there any questions for Shelley?
Very high level, Corinna. I feel like you probably wanted something more detailed. Hello.
Hi, Shelley.
Yes.
I don't know that I have a question. It's sort of a comment. It's something that you mentioned sort of struck me when you were talking about the fair and fair enough. And that, to me, that sort of almost sounds like a cop-out. And it sounds like we've been pushing this through our community, saying we need fair data. This is what it, these are the components that go into it. And then you're coming back and you're saying, well, okay, you don't have to do this. You can do this. And early on, I think this is probably what led to the initial development of PASTA with the LTR, when we had, data, metadata that was in all different states. What was developed was this, they called it the tiered trajectory. And I think some of the people that LTR people that have been involved longer can talk to this more, but it was sort of like a criteria saying, well, these are the different levels of where your data is. And, this is what you can do at those, given those levels. So it's sort of like you're targeting and you're trying to move up the sort of the grid. Yes. And to me, that seems like a sort of a more holistic, healthy way to look at it than just saying, okay, we're going to accept fair enough. What do you think about that?
Well, you're right. You're absolutely right. And I acknowledge the fact that, we'd love to have all, and remembering that EDI is ahead of most repositories. Like if you line them all up, EDI is going to tick far more boxes than most. So your community is already working towards those higher level capabilities. So the fact that you're pushing the bar further and having this conversation just is a real testament to the years of work you've put in. So that when we're talking to an international community, we are talking to everyone. Do you have a DOI on your data? Come on, guys. So there's all levels. And I think the way I would, if you look at the recommendations, you'll see that we went with 3 levels: required, recommended, and then required and recommended. I'm trying to remember if it was 2 or 3. I should have looked. Okay, don't laugh at me. It's either 2 or 3, but there's required, recommended, and then depending on your discipline,
Useful.
Okay, thanks. Required, recommended, useful. So we do give you those levels, and that was an accommodation for the fact that there's variation out there, and everyone's going to be on a journey, and we want people to feel like they can get somewhere. So that being said, for your community, you are in the brilliant position of providing a value statement and backing it up. You have so many examples of how your data, because of adding on to those time series data and having it in a common place with common metadata and common ways of discovery, and the type of research that's being done where that is valuable to your community, you have a feedback loop that's strong. And so you really do want as much as possible, because that gives directly back to your researchers. So I would say you have the best argument for putting the most effort into really good metadata and as much participation as possible from your community. And that is the best you can get. Things start to get wonky when you read the data reuse is a little dodgy. So you think of other disciplines, for instance, chemistry, when they're doing chemistry experiments, sometimes you're not, they're so easy to repeat that they would rather do their own experiment again, trust their own data, and not ever use somebody else's. I get that a lot, by the way, when I go talk to the folks at ACS and IUPAC, they're like, yeah, Shelley, but it's easier for us, and we don't really trust that other lab, and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, well, don't you see the value in having comparative information? And yeah, but that's not what, that's what my research is about. They miss the point. They completely miss the point, because they're, I don't want to say myopic, but their research is specific, and they don't see that having access to everybody else's data is valuable, but your community does. And that's brilliant. So yes.
And that's an amazing, thank you, Shelley. That's an amazing segue into what we really need to consider, that how to get our community involved in this discussion. Because when we start looking into more detail of these criteria, you will quickly realize that it's not only metadata, but it even goes into how to communicate the fulfillment of that criterion that we are looking at. And there are still some gaps and some discussion going on. So to go into this a little, I'm doing a few introductory slides here, and then Mary is going to tell us about how she has been using this at her site. So what I've done is I've looked at these different frameworks. So the RDA is here with broken down into findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable criteria. And this is just plain the number of criteria that I have tried to identify in that framework that's there. And then I talked about the DataONE FAIR suite, and these are the number of criteria that I found there. And some are overlapping, not all of them. So together they make up about 20 per category, give or take. And so then looking further on how to implement these criteria, The EML schema actually, with its requirements within the XML schema, already fulfills a handful of them. And then I identified a few that I don't think we can actually express in EML. And then, of course, the EDI repository service comes in, and in fulfilling a fair amount, and obviously accessibility. There is a lot of accessibility that just having it in a good repository will provide. And then EDI has its congruence checker, which is a quality checker, or a checker where we check the metadata against the actual data. And so this congruence checker actually has been around long before FAIR, the acronym FAIR, was coined, as Shelley already mentioned. So EDI and LTR and EML developers really have been thinking about this for a very, very long time. So the DataONE FAIR suite, you probably all know how that is being implemented in the DataONE website. So this is one of our data sets, and they now have settled on 51 checks. And for this particular data set, there are 8 warnings and 7 failed, and the rest is all coming through. And here too, they have implemented different categories for whether it's required or recommended, or I don't know what their third category is. Anyway, so that is sort of the basis that I've been working with. And then I have started analyzing the metadata in EDI. So now we're doing really just what can be expressed in the metadata. And what you can see here is on the left side, all these criteria where the complete data corpus of EDI is doing extremely well. So this is all in percentage data sets that actually fulfill those criteria. And we're only coming down here a little off the 100% with spatial extent and attribute definitions being good enough. And here on the right side are those criteria that we're not doing too well. And that generally goes into how much is being said. So attribute data table description, sufficient. Whenever you see the word sufficient, that means that there was a limit of or a maximum of a certain number of words that were expected. So here's one example in the DataONE FAIR suite. They're expecting 100 words in an abstract, while we in the EDI quality check only look for 20 words. So 20 words, we're doing pretty good. 100 words, we're not doing so well. And that, of course, all kind of comes down to how findable the data sets are. The less words there are, the less we can search on. And then we get down here into checksums, keyword types, and the IDs. So the creator ID and the data contact ID. And so now there are a few things that you probably think immediately, well, maybe we don't want a contact ID because that is a role at our place. So what I'm trying to say here is that there is still a fair room for interpretation. There is quite a bit of room for how this will be implemented. And all of this really needs to be discussed. And so what I've tried to do here is an overview of all of these criteria. So what the RDA is, what the DataONE suite is. Can you see this, by the way?
Yes, Corinna.
Oh, thank you. I can't see you anymore. And here, whether the EML schema or the EDI check is covering it. And that is in the GitHub that anybody can access. And then I've got some example code to just show you how I have been looking for this information in EML. And this is all in R. And then for a single EML file, it will calculate how well this has been done in terms of FAIR. And this is the place where I'll hand it over to Mary, because she has been using this code to evaluate her data sets at Hubbard Brook. Mary, introduce yourself, please.
Sorry. Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I couldn't find my unmute once I shared. Okay, great. So I am the information manager for the Hubbard Brook LTER site. And let me get this up to full screen. I've been there for about 10 years. And the whole FAIR discussion really sort of came on my radar just prior to our midterm review back in 2019. And fortunately, there had been some EDI presentations and LTER presentations on FAIR just prior to that. And I don't know why it clicked in my head, but just before I had my review with the IM reviewer, I'm like, yeah, I better go back and look, because I really didn't understand it quite as well as I do now, even though I don't understand all of it now either. But I went back and I looked at all of that, and wouldn't you know, I had a non-LTER midterm reviewer, and the first thing that he wanted to discuss was how we met FAIR criteria for our data. So this all sort of came very rapidly, with just kind of starting to hear about it and then really being questioned about it. So since then, I often think that, yes, I know qualitatively that our data are fair sort of because of two things. One is the services that are provided by EDI, and the other is through the work that we do as IMs working with our PIs to make sure that our metadata is really detailed and we have everything in there. So and we're getting ready for our renewal, working on a data management plan. And in the RFP for the renewal, they don't explicitly say anything about FAIR, but they do point out to looking at these other sources of guidance for DMPs, and one is to the bio-DMP, and that does explicitly call out the fact that we should identify how we go about making sure our data are fair. And then last month at the EDI town hall, Corinna showcased that code that you just saw scroll by on her screen. And that just seemed to be a good path to actually taking some of these things that I could talk about in qualitative terms and turn them maybe into a more quantitative assessment of our data. So how fair are our data? What can we do to make things better? And how do we set priorities for going back into metadata and data packages that we develop over time and making them a little bit better? So, so you saw this on the website for the code that Corinna just showed, and this is the output from that code. If you just take it right off that website and run it, and you get that for one data package. So I sort of saw this as being sort of a two-pronged thing. One is first evaluating all of the data that we currently have in EDI, and then using this also as a tool when I develop a new data set, just to run this little suite of tests on it to make sure I haven't missed anything. So I took Corinna's code and put a little loop around it and just ran it for all of the Hubbard Brook data. So you see all of the tests down here, and these are all of our data packages. We have 260 data packages now. And some of these things I think are really important, and I know that we're doing a good job on, and I don't even really think that I need a test, but it is nice to confirm that 100% of our data sets do have a publication date and do have a license and certain things like that. So this is just a good little test of that to develop those metrics. But then some of the other things that are interesting that I think are maybe not just the absolute value that shows up in one of these columns, but how it relates to others. So if we have 6 entities and we want to make, I want to make sure that that matches the number downloadable. So I can do little tests here in comparing them. And this is all, these are just screenshots from what I'm working on today. So this is all a work in progress, and I don't really know the path I'm going down, but these are some things that I'm trying out with this. Then there are other tests like taxonomic coverage, which we don't have taxonomic coverage for a lot of data sets because it's not appropriate. So there are there's other information that I need to make sense of whether the yes or no is good or bad for a data set in terms of taxonomic coverage. So one thing that I did is I plotted timelines, and this is just a timeline from the earliest publication date to the current publication date. And this is about where I started using EML assembly line. So certain things you didn't see at all in our older data, and these are data packages that haven't been updated because we've had data online for 30 years. So, and all of these have been in PASTA since 2013, these early ones, but we didn't put in the ORC IDs. I wasn't using taxonomic coverage, and we didn't put checksums in our data. So you can kind of see this break point here where things are getting better. But there's a lot of room for improvement, and there are certain data sets that are really important back in time that have just sort of been published in static that really could use some updates. So one thing that I'm trying to do is set some of my priorities based on additional information about the data sets. And this is the example of the taxonomic coverage. So I can see that I don't have taxonomic coverage for a lot of data sets, only about 8% if I look at all data sets, but it's really only appropriate for the vegetation and animal data sets, not stream flow and soil chemistry. So if I look at that, I'm doing a little bit better. And then I can also join in some data on which are our core and significant data sets, and there I'm doing a little bit better. But I have a lot of work to do. There's 75% of core data sets that don't have taxonomy. And this is something that actually I know will improve a lot in the next couple of weeks because I have a whole set of updates to these data sets, and now they will have the taxonomy added into them. So this is just sort of a way of, once I do this analysis this is all done in R2, I can get a list of all of those data sets and then start to look through them and see which ones I should spend my time on and go back. Right now, I'm so swamped with new data that people want in before the proposal that this will happen after the proposal in some cases. And another place that I'm looking for where I might set priorities is based on how popular data sets are. And to figure that out, I just recently started using another bit of code that Corinna shared with us on the EDI utils package where we can retrieve the download stats. So this is the last 3 years, the download stats. It's very interesting because I can pull, this is just total downloads, but I can pull out frequency of downloads for individual data sets and look to see how popular they are. It's very interesting when I see all of these spikes, I'd look to see which data sets are causing those, and they are our primary core data sets. So I don't think there's, I think these numbers are pretty good. So pulling all this kind of stuff together, I think I'm sort of coming up with a list of where I want to go back, take a look at some of the older data sets. And one thing that I'll say is that when I did this timeline, this jumped out at me. Where is it? Checksums, because I have been having checksums in, but then all of a sudden I had about 30 old GIS data sets, and I went back in a couple of weeks ago and I added I changed the contact and changed the author on those data sets, just so that they were for a service and not tied to an individual. And while I was in there, I sort of overlooked the fact that I could have updated the checksums at the same time. So you see that where those 30 data sets just drop out there. It's like, so today putting this slide together, I was already learning things that kind of inform where I might pick this up and do more work. So I'd be thrilled to hear about everyone else's ideas on how they would use this information, and I'll start incorporating it into what I do.
Looks like Shelley already has a question for you.
Mary, that is so cool to see. So I don't know when ORCIDs actually started. Your picture may just, your graph might actually just identify when ORCID came.
It is about that time, right?
Yeah.
And since none of those data sets, those earlier data sets have been updated, if I updated them now, I could put the ORCIDs in there.
Yeah, that would be interesting. And
yeah,
the other thing that I think would be fascinating to do is when you're showing the download spikes, good metadata begets discovery. So I'm not sure that you should drive on popular because you are influencing popular.
Yes.
So I would be really, so with that in mind, I see if you can remove the core data sets and see what's left.
Yeah.
Because if you already have,
yeah.
And I would be really interested what pattern you saw, and then how you could influence, like for instance, we have a lot of work looking at male and female editors, reviewers, and authors. And we spend a lot of time on this because in the geosciences, we are heavily we're fully on. So one of the very first reports we ran, and this is now a few years ago, if you don't have a good balance of reviewers, then that reflects on your editors. So what we did is once we had that information, we went very quickly back to our editors just to make them aware that they're being biased, right? And trained them on being biased and encouraged them to have more equitable selections of reviewers. It had an immediate impact. So you might see something in your data where you can adjust rhetoric to your creators or somebody that could have an immediate impact on how good your metadata is, and then drive up downloads. So that would be really cool to see.
Yeah.
And a great paper to write, by the way.
We're working on it, Shelley. Any other questions for Mary? Before we dive into the really nitty-gritty detail, which I'm going to pull up now. So I'm sorry about the poor screenshot quality here, but I hope you can read it a little. So I've tried to put these criteria, well, not tried, I've put them into their respective categories that other people have put them in. But what I've done is wherever we have an EDI check or the EDI repository is already providing for this particular criterion, it's gray. So you don't need to look at this. Then this yellow area here is, I think, where EDI can automatically add that information. And I think we're already doing this for most of the new ones that are coming in. So an entity identifier, you may remember that we were talking about it, what would happen if we overrode your entity identifier. And so I think we came to the conclusion that it would work for our metadata. And then I've got one here in orange, oops, which is a place where I think we could all work together better. And I don't know if you remember, but John Ide wrote a new name harmonization service, web service, that will take in various types of name spellings and abbreviations and various first name inclusions or exclusions and try to resolve it. And so he also uses the ORCID ID if it is there. So the more ORCID IDs are going in, the more we can help find them and kind of provide this information back. Something to talk about, something to think about. And the other part to think about is, what is it that EDI can just put into your metadata without overriding any major information that was in there before? And what kind of improvements are you all comfortable with us doing? So, and then here down here, the pink one is something that just needs to be provided in the metadata. So there's not a whole lot of automation. There's not a whole lot we can do. And that just needs to be dealt with. So findable, accessible. Accessible is obviously pretty well covered. We are now inserting a publisher as being EDI, and so EDI's ROR will be in there, so that will be covered. And then obviously EDI is the resource publishers. I am having a hard time here with my clicking. And then in RDA, the data identifier resolves to a digital object. So that goes back to the identity ID that we talked about earlier in the other part. So you can see that even those things are not exactly and not even in the same category for different interpretations here. Same idea here with the research distribution contact identifier, although that may actually be difficult for LTRs because probably most of you, I don't know, I do have the contact being just a role and the email just goes then to the next data manager whenever that person comes on board. So for this one, I personally find that the email is more important than an identifier, an ORCID, because we wouldn't get one. The last green one here is an example of how these things are being differently interpreted. So there's this discrepancy between metadata identifier, data identifier, and data package identifier, which is the concept that we're using. And again, it's just something to start thinking about. And then in data one, the interpretation is that it will only look in one place in the EML, while we have our resolvable metadata or data identifier, the DOI, is in the additional identifier or alternate identifier or whatever that field is called. So there are interpretations that we probably now need to be aware of and start discussing and bringing up and talking about it. So as we get into the next category, the interoperable, we're not looking quite as good anymore, but so the first few are again covered. And then there's a whole bunch that again just really needs to be provided. And then there is an area which I call provenance here, where actually we probably still need to talk about the technology or the standards of how to even report that from one system to the other. So there's obviously the EML way of doing it with a data source element, and then there is the PROF standard and the PROF1 standard, I think is what it's called. So there is still a huge area of negotiation and other standards that need to be developed and implemented and agreed upon. And then the last part here is what I would call the annotations and using vocabulary. So we obviously have the LTR vocabulary, But we're also thinking about other implementations, more an ontological implementation with from different ontologies. And so I think this is a very large area of upcoming collaborations among us all here to figure this out. And then the reusable one, we're starting to lose all our implementations here already. So the first few are there. And then I've sort of put them into blocks here. And that is the license. Most of our data sets are starting to have a license. Way back when, we were the first ones to have this intellectual rights element, which was supposed to be for the license. And now there are really official, what is considered to be a license. The new EML standard has a place for them where this can go in. So we probably need to implement all of those things in our respective data management systems. And then this last one here, machine understandable reuse license. Shelley, is that just a URL that refers to CC BY, or is there more behind it? I don't need to put you on the spot here for the details.
There's a lot of conversation that happened as we walked through. So I'm happy to expound on that. And you know, some of those guidelines, those scoping, kept us where the FAIR principles had originally intended, but the community had evolved since then. So some things we can, there's more flexibility that you should take because we're just not the same place we were in 2016. Yeah. So I can get you more data on what the community was thinking when we grappled with it.
Yeah, that would be great. Then comes here some formatting and precision and quality description. So that is all areas that we hear a lot from the modelers. So if they all keep telling us, if you only could tell us the quality of your data and what the restrictions are and what you can use them for. And I think this is just extremely hard. So I'm not even sure we can get there much at all because that is probably the scientists that need to provide it. And I'm not quite sure there is any good guidance out yet on that one. And so then comes a little more provenance here again under the reusable. And that is just being interpreted differently at DataONE and their quality checks than we would do it. And so these are all the things that we really need to discuss. And here at the very bottom is this data complies with a community standard. And so here comes our EcoComDP work in, and probably a lot of other kind of reformatting efforts, our ClimeDB, all of these, and then hopefully even passing some of the data on to other repositories where they really are in a community standard. And so those are the nitty-gritty details here, and I think I'm done. And the time is almost up. Any thoughts? Any questions? Kaylin.
Hey, Corinna, this has been such an awesome presentation. Thank you for putting this together. I loved the code that you shared that Mary used for Hubbard Brook, and I was wondering if there's any way that could be implemented into assembly line in such a way, for example, that you could run that as a function and just be like, yes, this passes checks, but you could make your data more fair, thinking about kind of what's that minimum fair standard, but a way in which you could improve in a certain, findable or increase, kind of whatever the different attribute was, just as a really easy way of thinking about pushing our community in a low stakes, low risk way, but also incentivizing that behavior too.
Yeah. So a lot of that is also implemented in the congruence checker. So when you submit your data and you go to the report, you will find a lot of them. It just looks a little different. That's why you're probably saying this. So, and we may need to reconsider the recommendations that are coming out of that report and phrasing it as fair, and maybe putting it into those categories, and coming up with better recommendations to say, well, if you did this, then yeah. So I'm sure eventually, once this really settles into some more agreement and a little less individual interpretations, we can put fair stamps on data sets, how fair they are. But before we do that, we need a lot more discussion and a lot more input and a lot more agreement. All right. If there aren't any other questions, we are at the hour and people are starting to drop off. Please email me if you're interested in any of this, and especially in any of the collaborations between us information managers and where EDI can help, and where we can maybe make more progress when we work together rather than everybody implementing it themselves.